The seeds were planted with the creation of modern central banks. Governments learned that by controlling the money supply and the interest rate, they could influence everything. How much people borrow, how much people spend, how much people save, and most importantly, how much people rely on the state during economic chaos. But none of this worked without a second ingredient: debt. In the early 1900s, debt was considered dangerous and shameful, so politicians reframed it. Debt became access. Debt became opportunity. Debt became the American dream. Economic mobility, student advancement. By changing the language, governments changed behavior, and dependence began. After World War II, something extraordinary happened. Governments realized that economic stability didn't come from producing goods, it came from producing spenders. People who constantly buy, people who constantly borrow, people who constantly need help during downturns. Enter the era of mass credit cards, 30-year mortgages, student loans, government-backed lending, welfare programs, and planned inflation. Inflation wasn't a mistake, it was a tool. A silent tax that forced people to spend now instead of saving for later. Because a population that saves too much becomes independent, and independence breaks the system. So the system evolved in one direction: keep people spending, keep people borrowing, keep people dependent. Then came the turning point, 1971, the moment the US dollar left the gold standard. Before this, money represented something real. After 1971, money represented trust. But trust can be manufactured and printed and inflated. Governments realized they could create money out of nothing, and the public would accept it as long as the system didn't collapse. This opened the door to permanent national debt, endless government spending, bailouts of private institutions, cycles of inflation and recession, wealth flowing upward while dependence flowed downward. For the first time in history, governments could expand the economy by expanding debt. And every crisis that followed, recessions, oil shocks, housing crashes, increased dependence even more. Because in every crisis, the same thing happened. The people lost. The big players were rescued. Governments gained more control. By the late 1990s and 2000s, a new pattern emerged. Boom gives debt, gives crash, gives bailout, gives dependence, gives repeat. People were encouraged to buy houses they couldn't afford. Corporations were encouraged to leverage debt beyond reason. Governments were encouraged to borrow without limits. The economy grew, but the foundation weakened. Then came 2008. The system cracked, and governments made a choice. They could let the system reset, or they could save it by making citizens even more dependent. They chose the second option. The result? Banks got trillions. Citizens got long-term costs. Wages stagnated. Debt exploded. Inflation became permanent. Ownership shifted upward. Dependence deepened downward. And the blueprint continued. Politicians began promising rescue after rescue. Stimulus checks, free money, zero interest rates, student loan, relief, housing incentives, more credit access, but every fix added another layer of dependence. And here's the irony. The system doesn't correct mistakes, it monetizes them. Governments discovered that debt creates dependence. Dependence creates stability. Stability keeps the system alive, and the system keeps the government in power. So nothing ever truly gets fixed, just gets delayed by increasing the population's dependence. To understand the blueprint, we have to go back, way back to the first governments that learned a powerful truth. Control over money means control over people. From ancient empires minting their own coins to European monarchies tax farming their citizens, to modern governments centralizing banking systems. One pattern keeps appearing. When leaders face financial pressure, they don't reduce it. They shift it on to citizens. But here's the twist. It's rarely done through force. Instead, it's done by reshaping the economic environment so gradually, so elegantly. That dependence begins to feel normal. But how does the blueprint actually work? To answer that, we need to go through the story in chronological order, from its origins to its rise, to the breaking point. The earliest version of economic dependence began with a simple realization. If people rely on the government for money, stability, or survival, the government gains long-term control. Centuries ago, rulers discovered 3 tools to create this reliance. 1. Controlled currency. The moment a government controls currency production, it can expand or contract the money supply at will. Rome did this by reducing silver content in coins. Kings did it by debasing gold reserves. Modern governments do it through central banks. 2. Mandatory taxation. Taxes started as temporary wartime measures. But leaders realized something powerful. Once a tax begins, it almost never goes away. It becomes normalized. 3. Regulated markets. Early governments approved or banned which tradespeople could enter. More rules equals more dependence on the authority issuing them. These 3 tools, currency control, taxation, and regulation, formed the foundation of the blueprint. But the true evolution came much later. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution. Factories rise, cities swell, wages become the primary source of survival. This is where the blueprint evolves from basic control to systemic dependence. Governments begin implementing strategies that look helpful on paper but quietly shift economic power upward. 1. The wage dependence model. Once workers rely solely on wages, they no longer control production. Governments and corporations now share the power over income stability. 2. Centralized banking. The creation of central banks was sold as stability. But it also meant governments now control interest rates, money printing, debt expansion, emergency policies. This centralization made populations more exposed to failures at the top. 3. Social welfare safety nets. These systems are crucial and life-saving. But they come with an unintended side effect: generational dependence on programs that are underfunded, overstrained, and politically controlled. But the most important shift came in the 20th century, when governments discovered the most effective dependence tool ever created. After the Great Depression and World War II, world economies were unstable. The solution? Not reducing spending, but borrowing more. This is the moment the blueprint goes into overdrive. Governments realized 3 major things. 1. Debt keeps economies growing artificially. More borrowing equals temporary growth equals political victories. But the debt never truly disappears. 2. Citizens will accept inflation if it's slow enough. A 2 to 3% inflation rate sounds harmless. But over 20 years, it destroys 40 to 60% of purchasing power. 3. People become dependent on rising prices. Housing rises, gives people take larger loans. Education rises, gives students take lifelong debt. Healthcare rises, gives insurance, becomes mandatory. Living costs rise, gives wages rarely keep up. Governments call this economic stimulation, but to millions of people, it becomes a lifetime trap. A system where saving loses value, borrowing becomes necessary, living expenses grow faster than income, and escaping the cycle becomes harder every year. The blueprint doesn't break the population. It makes the population predictable. As the blueprint spreads globally, 3 massive side effects emerge. 1. Wealth concentration intensifies. The top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 50% combined in many countries. 2. Financial crises become more frequent. 2008 wasn't an accident. It was the logical result of a system addicted to credit expansion. 3. Citizens lose economic autonomy. People don't choose jobs for purpose anymore. They choose jobs to survive, to pay bills, to pay debts that never seem to end. Governments respond with fixes, but Every time a crisis hits, governments repeat the same steps: print money, lower interest rates, create new taxes, introduce temporary programs that become permanent, increase national debt, add new regulations that limit citizens while expanding state power. These aren't new solutions. Their patches apply to the same underlying design. The blueprint doesn't collapse. It resets and becomes stronger. Today, the blueprint is more visible than ever. Shocking modern numbers. Global debt has surpassed $315 trillion. Inflation has wiped out the last decade of wage growth in many countries. Over 60% of people live paycheck to paycheck even in wealthy nations. Housing affordability is the worst it has been in 70 years. Education debt is so large it rivals national defense budgets. And yet, people believe they are free to earn, but not free from the system controlling what their money can buy. Free to borrow, but not free from the debt that follows them for decades. This is not accidental. It is the blueprint, a repeating pattern that outlives leaders, governments, and even entire political systems. Takeaway 1. Economic dependence is engineered through slow, gradual changes, never sudden ones. Takeaway 2. Debt is the cornerstone of modern economic control. It keeps economies running, but keeps citizens restrained. Takeaway 3. Understanding the blueprint is the first step to escaping it. Awareness breaks dependence. For decades, we've been told a simple story: work hard, save money. Everything will be fine. But the modern economic world doesn't work like that anymore. Something changed, quietly, systematically, behind every price you pay, behind every paycheck that feels too small, behind every financial struggle. There's a system designed to keep you just comfortable enough to continue working, but never secure enough to stop depending on the state. To understand how this started, we have to go back. Far back to a moment when governments realized a dangerous truth: control the economy, and you control the people. The origins trace back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, a time of fast industrialization. Millions of people were moving to cities. Factories were exploding with production. Wealth was shifting faster than governments could manage, and governments felt threatened. Because freedom, economic freedom, was spreading too quickly. In response, politicians and economists created something they had never used before: centralized economic architecture, central banks, national taxes, controlled currency supply, regulated wages, and state-run safety nets. These tools didn't start with bad intentions. They were introduced to create stability. But stability came with a hidden price: control. Plus, once a government controls money, it controls everything money affects: your job, your savings, your future, your freedom. This was the first step of the blueprint: place the government at the center of all financial life. After World War II, governments discovered something shocking. People became easier to manage when the state became their primary financial fallback. And so began the era of strategic dependence. 1. The illusion of security. Governments expanded welfare programs, retirement systems, subsidies, and grants. These systems helped millions of people, but they also created a subtle shift. Citizens began depending on the state for survival. 2. Debt as a lifestyle. Homes, education, cars, health. Everything began shifting from buy when you can to buy now. Pay for decades. Governments encouraged banks to offer long-term credit. Why? Because people in debt are predictable. They work harder, they spend more, and they rarely challenge authority. 3. Inflation as policy. Inflation wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate tool, a slow, silent thief that reduces the value of your savings every year. Citizens don't notice it, but governments benefit massively from it. By the 1970s, economic dependence wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system.